So yeah, thank you again, everyone, for coming. For those of you who are just coming on, we have an amazing representation of so many people from BCM, from the very beginning all the way to people that are new to us within the past couple of weeks. We have staff, we have founders, we have volunteers, we have many friends and family of the ministry, church partners, educators, nonprofit partners, and on and on. So it's really great to have you all here tonight, and we're yeah, grateful for the opportunity to share. And kind of as Andrew was mentioning in his opening prayer, there has been racial tension in our nation and in our community for a very long time. But at this particular moment in history, there is a greater awareness of racism, of racial injustice, of systems that have treated certain groups of people unfairly, based on a variety of differences, but in particular, there's been a clear focus on the injustices towards the African American community in the United States. And it's also a time of renewed momentum towards change, I think particularly as Christians, towards reconciliation, including racial reconciliation. So it's a bringing to the surface of both what's wrong and also the potential for what can be right, and what could be the way that it is intended to be. I think, as many of you know, BCM has been in the community for over 35 years, and racial injustice has been a part of the East Palo Alto community way before BCM was ever even a thought in anyone's mind, and has continued to be part of that story all the way up until the present. This is not the first time that BCM has done this presentation that you're going to hear tonight. We've shared it with staff and with volunteers and with short-term mission teams and with church partners and many others over the years, because we feel it's really important to share the story of our community, and in particular of some of the injustices that have happened. It's important for us to be able to effectively serve with compassion, with understanding, and to serve with an accurate perspective on our community's history. And at this point in time, we wanted to highlight that sharing the story of our community is one that includes racial injustice, but ours is not the only story. It is part of broader dynamics that have been at place in our nation for many years, and continue to affect the students and families that we serve as BCM, but also affect people throughout our country. And so as part of this movement, looking towards change and towards reconciliation, we do want to kind of highlight our story as a part of sharing, the broader story and the realities, again, in hopes that this can move us towards more effectively loving and serving our community, but also being part of, bringing racial reconciliation to our communities. So we're really glad that you guys are here tonight. Most of you know Rolando and/or Andrew. So Andrew is actually part of the founding of BCM and was executive director for many years, and then was away for about a decade, and then God has brought him back to East Palo Alto and to BCM to continue ministry here. So he has learned and led and been part of the community for many years. Rolando is our executive director for just a short few more days here. But he has also been in part of the East Palo Alto community, initially with another nonprofit before joining BCM, and has always been very attentive to the history of the community and the dynamics and how they, affect the community in the present day moment. So the two of them have a lot of great information and stories to share with you all. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to them.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Thank you all, and welcome. And I'm glad you're all here. And I hope that today is just the beginning of a conversation. And there's a lot of material. My intent was to have my notes in front of me, but given the dynamics of Zoom, I may not be able to do that quite as I planned. But I'll be reading. I'm smiling only because Amy kind of knows that a moment ago I had some hiccups. So if they come back, I might just pass the baton to somebody else to finish. But anyway, that note, let's just get started. Righty. So our community has an amazing, very rich multicultural history. As much of the settlers in the Bay Area there's the early settlers of the area were the Costonian Native Americans, also known as the Ohlone tribe, and who settled initially in the land that's now East Palo Alto. And the Ohlone that made up the home where EPA is today were known as the Poichon. And then after that, the land was settled by Spanish ranchers, and due to the gold rush, as much of the Bay Area was settled. And in 1949, a wharf was built. The vision was to create East Palo or Ravenswood. The town was Ravenswood as a waterfront town, interesting enough. So there was the deep channel to the southernmost part of the bay, and that's where the wharf kind of connected that. And the vision was to create this very active industrial base. The railroad, the Southern Pacific ran a railroad line down there. Part of that early 19th century history, there was a gentleman that took off and changed the name to Cooley. Lester Cooley bought it. And then it's known as Cooley's Landing, which many of you can now go to the end of Bay Road, all the way down to the end. And there's a beautiful new building out there, and then it's now part of a park. Interesting enough, in the 1920s, there was another vision of the community around 1 acre of independence. There was Charles Weeks was a gentleman that created the Runnymede colony, and at one point in its peak had about 1,200 people, and it was a turnkey poultry farming facility. So for X amount of dollars, you bought that 1 acre, you had to buy whatever number of chickens, and then they can guarantee you a model for you to be able to have some subsistence. But then folks realized how much harder it was to have poultry and so on, and ended up Charles Weeks ended up going to Southern California, and so the colony kind of lost its flavor there. And then in the 30s and 40s, it was an immigration wave of other immigrants who, particularly Asian immigrants and Japanese immigrants, who came to grow flowers in that community. So those are some of the early efforts of industry and so on that affect our community. In terms of one of the things that you'll see in common is the role that the freeway or the highway takes in our community. In the 30s, the Bayshore Highway was initially created, and that kind of brought a lot of commerce around the University Avenue area, and around that there was around the University Square, that part of town was called Whiskey Gulch, and then some of you might know why. There was a lot of bars and liquor stores, and that's a result of Palo Alto zoning, and the laws were such that Stanford University restricted alcohol sales within a 2-mile radius of the campus. So that happened to be over the creek, and that happened to be just over that edge. So that's where the name came from in terms of Whiskey Gulch. And then the other area of growth in terms of industry around this time before the Second World War was again the northern side of the town, where there was a lot of today there's a lot of light industry now, but there was a chemical plant installed in that time, and some other type of heavy industry in that area. So coming to the cities evolved into a suburban community. Again, began as Runnymede, and then escalated after the Second World War. There was a lot of homes being built in the middle part of town, and there was folks from the San Francisco buying weekend homes and so on. And one of the things that drove again the development, and you can see here in the middle of this map, is the Bayshore Freeway, and that split East Palo Alto in 2 parts. And this is interesting because this is a historical map that shows the larger area of Palo Alto, or East Palo Alto, before chunks of the industrial area was annexed by adjacent city. Palo Alto needed a a golf course and an airport, and it became it seemed some of this area, and it was all unincorporated at that point. So neighboring cities definitely took a lot of that land away from the what has now become East Palo Alto. So informal redlining worked alongside blockbusting to limit the places where families of color could purchase homes. Quite often, families' offers of homes would not be accepted or entertained in other parts of the Bay, and at times discrimination and restrictions barred people of color from buying homes in many other areas. Blockbusting was when a real estate agent who contributed to this demographic shift in the 1960s, and basically a real estate agent used scare tactics to scare white owners into selling their homes and moving and then encouraging the sale of that home by claiming that the fact that people of color or Black folks were moving to the neighborhood, and that's where going to drive prices down, and then they were going to lose property values. At the same time, these agents offered Black residents and potential home buyers free bus rides to the city to encourage families to move in and buy in East Palo Alto specifically. Real estate agents profited on both ends of the deal, and the population resulted in a significant population shift from about 70% white in 1960 to over 60% African American in 1970. And there was different efforts of incorporation around this time. In 1958, there was an attempt to incorporate the city into the town of Ravens, but it failed to pass. Andrew, I think you had some thoughts too.
Bayshore Christian Ministries started in 1984. There will be some things later that kind of connect to that. But just over the years of living here, I've had the chance to meet a lot of families who were involved in the blockbusting, kind of on both sides of it. So, you know, there were all these almost entirely white neighborhoods, and realtors would show up knocking on doors, would present their business card or some other information and say, you know, if you want to sell, you know, please get in touch. And people would say, oh no, we're happy here. We're not thinking, well, a lot of your neighbors are thinking about moving, you know, because of the Black families moving in. Like, the what? You know what? And then the same realtors would basically bring African-American families from Oakland and San Francisco in on bus tours on the weekend, and you know, showing them this is the one place in the area where you can buy a home. And so, you know, I've had a chance to talk to a lot of the African-American families who moved in that first wave of change, and a good number of the white families that moved out. And, you know, you couldn't emphasize enough how much racism was at the root of the demographic change. It wasn't some sort of accident. It wasn't some sort of gradual thing or market-based. The realtors figured that they could make a killing based on the racism of the white population. They put it to the test and it worked. It's also interesting, like among the white families that I've talked to, a lot of them will talk about how horrified they were at some of the things they heard from their neighbors who they thought they'd always known. You know, it's just some of this really horrific racist kind of stuff. But then also a lot of them, you know, it's like, well, you know, how long did you stay? Well, I moved out. What led you to move out? It was the housing values. And so, you know, so those are just some facts. I think that I'll just leave it at that. There was kind of both of these things of just a number of families who wanted to leave because they were worried about what was going to happen with their housing prices. And there was a whole lot of just really overt, nasty, racist response. And it didn't end in the first few years of the big shift. That the population really dramatically changed over the course of about 4 years. I mean, it was a really rapid change. there's my piece.
Excellent. So East Palo Alto was unincorporated during this time, and as such was governed by the county. And residents complained that they didn't have a say in the decisions that affected them. So in 1966, the county supervisor established the East Palo Alto Municipal Council and Advisory Board, which was fairly unique in the country at that time. In 1968, an election was held to rename East Palo Alto. Several alternatives were considered, including Uruhu, Kenyatta, and NAIROBI was settled upon. The measure, however, was defeated in a ratio of more than 2-to-1. At that time, the greatest support of the name came from 18 to 21-year-olds of age, and it was believed that the voting age had been younger, around 18. East Palo Alto would have been known as NAIROBI today. One of the frustrations of not being incorporated was the number of special districts to which residents pay taxes for such services such as drainage, fire protection, garbage, sanitation, lighting, etc. And they had over, I believe, 37 special districts that in the 60s, East Palo Alto had jurisdiction which had over East Palo Alto. So consolidation of these and the services was one of the arguments used to support incorporation later, many years later. During this time in 1960s, there was a nationwide Black Pride movement. There were emerging views on resident empowerment. One that tried to change thin established systems, and another one that felt there was a much more radical change that would be necessary. Andrew.
So again, when I moved in, you still saw signs for NAIROBI schools. And that NAIROBI village sign looks familiar to me. Maybe it's only from the pictures though, because the building certainly doesn't. But that whole sense of the kind of the Black Pride movement was very present through the 80s and 90s, especially. And East Palo Alto was kind of a hub nationally for African American culture. One of the interesting things that comes of that is just our school district goes kindergarten through 8th grade, and we had a long history of no high schools in the community, which is no longer the case, and I'll just leave it at that. And 8th grade graduation was huge. It was this big community event, and I don't know if you had an 8th grade graduation. I don't know if you had a speaker. I don't know if you'd remember who the speaker was. But, if you had Coretta Scott King as your 8th grade graduation speaker, or the actress Esther Roll, or congresswomen, you'd probably remember it. And that's who we had year after year for our 8th grade graduations. So there was just this whole kind of cultural vibrancy that is a big part of the history of the community. And especially as you talk to folks who've been here a long time, sometimes it's hard to get a handle on just, what is all this pride and this stake of ownership? And I think that is one of the big parts of that.
Thank you. During this time, there were a lot of efforts in seeking educational equity. Nearly 650 students attended Ravenswood High School when it opened in 1958. Originally, pupils were predominantly white, but by 1969, 87% of the student body was African American. The impact of the freeway it created, isolated the high school, and the demographics just led to that. Also led for calls for desegregation. For the high school, so volunteering began about 2 years later. And brought in and tried to bring equal racial balance to the school. But enrollment declined to half what it was a few years before. So the school, Ravenswood High School, closed in 1975, 1976, around that time. And high school students from that point, high school students from East Palo Alto would then bus out of the community to high schools in neighboring cities. EPO would not host the high school graduation in its city bounds until June 15th, year 2000, when Eastside College Prep graduated its first class of students of 8 students 24 years after the closing of Ravenswood High School. In 1966, Gertrude Wilkes, Miss Wilkes, right here, picture in the middle, launched an alternative approach to design to improve education opportunities for East Palo Alto children. She was quoted as saying, her oldest son, Otis Jr., graduated from Ravenswood High School and could not read and was very unhappy about it. So she started with a group of other mothers. Some 75 students participated in a sneak out program where students stay with families in Palo Alto and Los Altos 5 days a week in order to attend local schools in those two school districts. This prompted other families to accomplish the same means by using false addresses to enroll children in their schools. Illegal at that time, in-the-district transfers later became a legitimate option. Other African Americans dissatisfied with mainstream education to turn to alternative schools that focus on Black pride, identity, and achievement. The first was EPA Day School, founded by Ms. Wilkes in 1966, and Mothers for Equal Education. It began by holding Saturday classes in the local church. Enrollment jumped to 300 on its second year, and classes expanded to Wednesday evenings. After the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the school evolved into NAIROBI High School and NAIROBI Elementary School. It taught over 500 students 5 days a week in 2 buildings off Runnymede. The schools endured until the 1980s, despite threats, bomb scares, and the fact that both buildings fell victim to suspected arson. NAIROBI College was also established by Mr. Bob Hoover in 1969 to meet the needs of people of color. The 2-year private school began with 120 students, grew to over 200 students in 1971, and lasted, kept the store open till about 1981. So as you can see, there's been a lot of thinking of finding ways that our youth can I'm not sure who that is, can get access to high quality education. There's also something else. There's also the Tinsley Volunteer Transfer Program. And that program was launched in 1987, which allows families to live within the boundaries of Ravenswood City School District to apply to transfer their children to other districts from Palo Alto north to Belmont Redwood Shores. Margaret Tinsley, an East Palo Alto resident, and 169 other parents and students filed a lawsuit alleging that unconstitutional segregation existed in all school districts from Palo Alto to San Carlos. A judge established the program in a court order in 1986, about 10 years later after the suit was filed. After a long legal battle involving many local parents and so on, the program's goals, as laid in the court order, was threefold: to reduce minority isolation in Mid-Peninsula schools, improve Ravenswood educational achievement, and enhance inter-school district cooperation. Over the past 33 years, the program has operated with relatively little changes. Non-minority students in these 6 districts may transfer into Ravenswood City School District. That means it's supposed to work both ways, but as you know, that doesn't quite happen. The original 8 school districts that were involved in the settlement, only 2, Redwood City and Belmont Redwood Shores, have reached a high enough minority ratio that no longer require enrollment of students into the districts under the settlement. So I'm not sure if Andrew or Amy, if you have any thoughts. All right. Sounds good. All right, now we're moving forward here to a very dynamic time of our city, incorporation, finally. East Palo Alto was incorporated in 1983 in one of the most, it's one of the most recently formed cities in the entire Bay Area. Prior to 1983, as we mentioned, it was part of San Mateo County as part of the incorporation. Efforts of incorporation early as 1920s, followed by more serious efforts of incorporation in 1950s and 60s. These efforts remained unsuccessful until the vote was held on June 7th, 1993, and the incorporation initially finally passed by a whopping 15 votes, 1,782 for and 1,767 against. Follow a contentious decision, the lawsuits were waged in court from 1983 to 1987. So even after the vote had passed, there was a number of lawsuits that were, well, let me stick to my notes here. Pete McCloskey, a former U.S. Congressman member, attorney, and real estate broker, mounted a legal challenge along with Gertrude Wilkes to stop the ballot measure and the election to decide incorporation. There was concern that the new city would not have enough tax-based support necessary for services, and the property taxes would skyrocket, driving property values down, which concerned a number of absentee landlords. In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal of the California Supreme Court decision to affirm incorporation, which was issued in 1986. Therefore, the legal battle was over then, and the city became a city on July 1st, 1983, officially. Even though, again, it was in the courts for a number of years after that, but the incorporation stood its ways. In many ways, incorporation and this effort was a movement for social and fiscal self-determination, following years of marginalization and neglect by outside powers. The campaign of incorporation was led by an ethnically diverse coalition of residents who believed their future and the children's future would be brighter if they were in charge of it. To meet religiously for every Tuesday to talk only about one issue, incorporation. And the first members of the city council were Ruben Audica, who is on the council today, James Blakely Jr., Mayor Barbara Mouton, Frank Olawale Satterwhite, and Gertrude Wilkes. So there's 3 members on the council who were for incorporation and 2 members on the council who were against it. Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, so Rolando, ending with that 3-2 council split. I mean, I think that's significant looking backwards and looking forward. You know, as he said earlier, there were at least 2 really different kind of viewpoints on what was going to sort of have the best results for the people of the community. How were people going to thrive? And for some people, it was getting access to sort of the wider Bay Area, reaping all those benefits. And you see that in some of the things like, you know, the Tinsley lawsuit, the sneaking out to get to schools, but in other ways as well. And then there was also this viewpoint that it's ours, we need to make it ours. And, you know, everything kind of needs to be homegrown and built from within. And a lot of that, it's not like a direct tie, but I think there's a lot of that that's tied in with that whole Black Pride movement. And it's interesting, the big split here did not go along racial lines. Rolando mentioned it was a multi-ethnic coalition. That was true on both sides. There were real differences on what was going to be success for the community. And so I moved in '84, a year after incorporation, and the early city council meetings were wild. I mean, very heated, some very clearly a bunch of folks who were not planning to work together, and had extremely different viewpoints. Lots of conflict, lots of communication where you're like, wow, this is happening in a city council meeting. And there was a lot of tension in the city government for years. There was a later group of leadership who really brought tremendous change to that. And that change, I think, has been really lasting. But man, those early days were kind of crazy. And then in the midst of that is when Bayshore Christian Ministries got started. A bunch of us who moved in. We were in the community when there were still everything was still kind of run with county services, and as things were gradually being developed by the city. So our history kind of went along with the history of the city as city, not as community, because that had gone a long way back.
Excellent, thank you. And then, so let's fast forward to the 90s, the early 90s. Due to the crack epidemic that infested many urban centers in our nation in the early 90s, as many of you know, in 1982, East Palo Alto, unfortunately, was given the moniker of the murder capital of the United States, beating East St. Louis for that title. The 42 homicides, many involving non-residents, out of a population of 24,000 people, just had that per capita ratio. And then, unfortunately, it's a stereotype that to this day I think pursues the city. I must say there were some admirable efforts by the faith community around that time responding to this crisis. They hosted prayer walks and street corner vigils to discourage folks from illicit activities. There was a lot of movement in making sure that the city was reclaimed. Fast forward, the need for tax revenue for the new city. And then in 1983, Gateway 101 area, the project was formed. This is where the IKEA is today. This is the shopping center, the Target, and so on. University Square houses is all along this area. And that was such a big deal. Unfortunately, over 700 people were displaced by this development. And you know, 2 large apartment complexes were torn down and so on. But again, the city was looking for ways to increase its revenue. Andrew?
Yeah, so just as a resident here, the recognition was that we had no tax base. And in California, sales tax going to cities is uniquely important. And we just had so little retail. Rolando mentioned, and he's going to mention again, Whiskey Gulch. And those were some small businesses, really well established, but they were not big money generators. And as things shifted with the policies that froze property taxes at a set rate, sales tax became more and more important. And so some of that new leadership in the city council that I was talking about went to work trying to get some redevelopment done. They poured a ton of time and life into it, made connections nationwide, studied how do you do this, what's the best way to do it, built this great plan. And there was a lot of opposition. Again, this was another place where there were definitely divergent views. There were people who were saying, don't redevelop, it's, we love our community as it is. And then there were other people who were saying, we have to redevelop because otherwise we're going to go out of business. We're going to be bankrupt. But everything was done really well. And then the problem was that with this great plan and all these state agencies and consultants involved, we couldn't get anybody to buy in. So we had the relocation of tenants in place, we had the construction in place, but we couldn't get anybody to say, we'll put a store here. And that fits a long history in this community, which has been partly driven by banks, and I'll just leave that at that for this moment. And the whole project looked like it was all this stuff that had already caused all this upheaval, and it might go for nothing. And one of the people who really made a huge difference here was Magic Johnson. He had a foundation out of LA, and some of our leaders met with one of their leaders, and the leader of the foundation just said, you should meet with him in person. This is the kind of project this is why he designed this foundation. And so he came in and offered a whole bunch of money guarantees and also used his clout to try to bring in other anchor tenants. And then that whole area was redeveloped, and it became the biggest retail center, by far in the community. And the tax base has made a huge difference. It's not the last of our developments, but it was the first, and it was the one that really caused a major change in terms of the economics.
Andrew, perhaps you can share some thoughts about the early Bible clubs.
Sure. One other thing on the relocation. One of the things is I had lived in the Cooley Apartments for a long time, which is one of the areas that got torn down. The organizing of tenants was an amazing undertaking. I mean, we spent out. I wouldn't even want to know how many hours we spent in tenant meetings, trying to make sure that everybody was served according to what was provided for in state law. And that made a huge impact for the tenants who were displaced. They all ended up in far better, generally they ended up in far better situations housing wise, and mostly as homeowners. The early Bible clubs, Bayshore Christian Ministries, we were just kind of this grassroots sort of thing. There were a bunch of us who had moved into the community to serve kids. We started developing more educational programs as we got to know the families. And at this point in time, we were just sort of bouncing around and borrowing or renting spaces wherever we could, because our programs had grown tremendously. And it wasn't always going to work just to go show up in a schoolyard and gather a bunch of kids and do your Bible club. But that was kind of our model in the early days.
Thanks. So let's talk about more redevelopment. And I'm not sure how many of you remember, in order to get to Palo Alto, you needed to drive through Whiskey Gulch. And that's the picture here on the left. That's the 2-block area of the closest to downtown East Palo Alto had. And according to then Mayor Sharifa Wilson, the University Square development, which is where the Four Seasons are and the 3 large office buildings, would bring in much needed tax revenue to the city, and that was forecasted in the year 2000 that was going to produce about $3.5 million in tax revenue, almost doubling the city's $4 million budget. But the impact of this development was quite significant. The city relocated about 80 apartments from Manhattan Avenue, and 39 businesses had to be either relocated or closed down. Many of these businesses shut down after finding nowhere else they can go that they could afford, or after relocating out of town due to lack of business, ended up closing their doors. Whiskey Gulch was also the home to a dozen different nonprofit agencies, and because of philanthropic efforts, some of them relocated to other parts of the city, and many of them congregated around what's known today as People's Plaza, which is a couple buildings that house a lot of these nonprofits near Bay Road and Polgas, and they're there today. The large identity of East Palo Alto's flavor of part of its soul was lost with this redevelopment, in the sense that there were so many minority-owned businesses that I hope one day can be reestablished in our community. And one other thought about the University Circle and that development, and the city also, part of the redevelopment effort or arrangement with some of these tenants was that they would set aside 30% of the jobs to residents in the community, and through a first hire initiative. But this is all a handshake deal. There's no law on it. And initially with IKEA, with some of these large developments, the vision of local residents being employed by these new tenants that can bring in jobs, I think has resulted in mixed thoughts over the years. And more recently with the Amazon construction, we exit 101, we get into East Palo Alto, we see this huge, enormous building with a big old smiling back at us, the Amazon, and And the question is, okay, 30% of the jobs from that company would land in our city, but they made other arrangements, and instead funding for a local job agency was instead negotiated instead of those jobs. But again, the city has made some efforts to try to have the residents have access to some of these jobs. Andrew, if you perhaps comment on the building, the BCM building around this time.
Yeah, just during that redevelopment is also when we created our facility, which a lot of you on this call have been to. And that was kind of the answer to the bouncing around different places, gave us a hub and a headquarters, which we are extremely thankful for up to today.
The 90s and today witnessed another big demographic shift in our community. East Palo Alto witnessed a 26% growth in population between the years 1990 and 2000. African Americans, whose numbers previously comprised a majority of the racial demographics, comprise a much smaller share of the population now. The Latino community doubled during this time. In the year 1990, Latino population stood at about 8,500 people, and by 2002 had reached over 17,000. According to the 2010 census, Latinos and African Americans remain as the two largest racial groups, with Latinos making up over 60% of the population, and African Americans about 16%. There's also a large Pacific Islander population comprising of about 7% of the population, and contributing to the remarkable diversity of our community. Asians and Caucasians comprise about 10% of the population. This is about 2010 data, so we found some 2019 data, as you can see in the chart. The primary language spoken by East Palo Alto is very much reflective of this shift. Spanish stands primary language spoken about 2/3 of the population in our city today. Per Ravenswood City School District statistics, over 80% of the student population is Latino. A couple of years ago, as part of our strategic planning process, we interviewed and had focus groups and asked our community, our parents, what were some of the stressors that they're beginning to feel. And definitely the effects of gentrification was on top of the list. The stress on the financial stress caused family stress, which is youth experience. The housing instability and the cost of housing, which many of us have seen, not just the area, but particularly in our community. And then just affordability. Traffic has always been an issue in our community as well. And just the anxiety surrounding immigration enforcement have been stressors. And this is pre-COVID. This is from a couple of years ago. So you can imagine some of the stressors today, situation that we have now. But just wanted to highlight some of this. So where's the community heading? Let's see. So I found this wonderful report from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation that was it's called a case study of East Palo Alto's water supply. And I found it to be a very interesting read because I think it mirrored and it reflected a lot of the racial injustices that we're talking about and how the water supply was limited to our community. And as you know, a couple of years ago, there was a moratorium on redevelopment in our community, meaning no additional buildings could be built because there was not enough water rights to go around. And East Palo Alto ended up buying water rights from the city of Mountain View, and recently were granted some additional water rights from the city of Palo Alto. They can approve and have enough capacity for water so that for the future development that's happening in the city. And so let me just read a section of this report because I think it mirrors this. And this is what it says. As this report shows, East Palo Alto's water crisis arose out of racial, economic, and political factors in the mid-20th century. The people of unincorporated East Palo Alto, historically a low-income community of color, lacked strong enough land use and water allocation decisions made by its neighbors. A surrounding jurisdiction is toxic industrial uses in East Palo Alto. That unincorporated area was to pursue economic development, which led to all the predictable social consequences. Early land use decisions in San Mateo and neighboring counties directed toxic industrial uses to East Palo Alto, while neighboring jurisdictions captured the lion's share of the region's economic development. As a result, East Palo Alto has struggled for decades to build a sustainable tax base and establish healthy jobs, housing balance. Who would have thought that water rights were so reflective of what's going on? But this is just an example yet again of this development. The trend line, just of violent crime, has dropped 60% from the 1990 levels, and we went from 42 homicides in 1982 to 1 homicide in 2017, decrease over 97%. Community policing has been, I believe, a successful model demonstrated in our community. Housing prices remain well above what local our residents can afford, and a lot of development in the works. As you know, there's condos to be made in this part of town, the west side. There's the 6-acre lot right here on the corner of University and Bay. That's going to be a multi-use, almost like a mini Santana Row feel. There's Epicenter Arts being built in this corner, and a lot of this land here is owned by one company that's been looking at redevelopment. And there's where Romic used to be on the city here. It looks to be built at 1.4 million square feet off commercial real estate building. So there's a lot of projects. Another school being built at the end of Runnymede for the primary school. So, and that's just the beginning. And then the question, of course, remains: how inclusive is this development going to be? And as we want to keep the diversity of our community alive. Andrew, any additional thoughts?
Is this our final slide, Rolando?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. If I could, I think I'll just kind of wrap up. So yes, we're covering the history of the community, and there's all kinds of aspects of what that history looks like. And I'm going to tie this to protests going on around the country. A big shock. One of the things that happens a lot is you see a video like of George Floyd, and if you haven't seen it, you should see it. And the conversation becomes, well, and I'm talking to the white folks here, so I hope nobody's offended by me saying that, but I'm really talking to us white folks. The conversations can become, well, you don't really know what was going on with that guy. I mean, that's one incident. We don't know. White people get killed by police. And the thing is, it ignores reality. All of those responses ignore reality. And it ignores a whole kind of existence that if you don't put yourself in the place to be part of and to experience and to see, it doesn't seem real. And this presentation hasn't been about violence. It's been about the development of a community. But when you look at it, the whole idea of this community was formed by a racist practice called blockbusting. The economic disaster of the community was caused by economic pressures, and also by specific decisions by banks and by businesses to disinvest. That happened all over the country. I heard a guy give a presentation about inner city Detroit, and I was like, oh my gosh, East Palo Alto, some differences, but it's the same thing and same timelines. Once East Palo Alto was established as a predominantly minority community, you can see, you know, when Palo Alto wanted something that was really useful to them, but it wasn't really desirable, they annexed land. Menlo Park did a little bit of that as well. The water rights that Rolando just went into, the chemical plant, nobody else would have had that. And the groundwater in this area is like super toxic. And so, you know, and so this is a short-ish, I know we're going a little long, this is a short-ish presentation, but I think what I really want to communicate is there's a theme and there's a reality here that is lived experience. And the dynamics around race really do, they factor in, and they factor into everything. And sometimes there's this thing of like, well, why does race have to be considered so important? Because it is, and because of these realities. And if you are able to live in a way where you can be separated from the realities, they can seem like they're unimportant. But if this is your heritage, it would be ridiculous to think about, why do we keep bringing up race? It becomes a ridiculous kind of thing to say. We bring it up because it's so relevant, so consistently relevant, not just in these big picture things, not just in violence, but I mean, we could have an 18-part series on other aspects of life and have the same kind of themes running through them. So, all right, so there we are. And as Bayshore Christian Ministries, you know, what we've always been about is loving God, loving people, looking at people as the whole people. And this is part of what it means to look at people as whole people, is to take the blinders off and look at real life, and to be able to be real. And that has always been part of our mission, part of the way we operate. And I didn't mean to get on a preaching thing, so I'm going to stop now, and we should do questions and responses.
Great. Rolando, do you mind stop sharing your screen? And we'd love as many people are comfortable to come back on video. If you turned your video off for the presentation part, we'll enter into a time of some question and response. Thank you, Rolando, and thank you, Andrew, for just sharing all the things that you have learned about our community. And yeah, I think similar to what Andrew just said, a lot of what defines East Palo Alto as a community has to do with racial injustice at all different levels, whether that's educational, whether that's economic, whether that has to do with the real estate market, and so many things in between, and how that's played out at higher levels in the community, and how that's played out in the lives of individuals. And so we wanted to give a little bit of time just for question and response. Rolando and Andrew are happy to do their best to respond to any questions you have about the history of the community, about BCM's role in that. And there's two ways that you can present your question. So you can either send me, Amy, a chat message, so you can go chat and you can select me, and then I'll compile those. Or you can also raise your hand, which you could do that physically, and I'll be able to see you, or you can also virtually raise your hand if you know how to do that, and I will also monitor virtual hand raising. So feel free to chat to raise your real hand or raise your virtual hand if you have something you'd like to ask Andrew or Rolando, something you'd like to learn more about, or a question. While I'm waiting for people to send in some thoughts or questions, just to give you a heads up, Andrew and Rolando, one of the questions, but we'll save it closer to the end, is what is the call to action for the broader BCM family, kind of given the community's history and where we're at right now. I'm trying to monitor a variety of things here. Karima, do you have a question? I didn't know if you were raising or just moving your hand.
I wasn't raising my hand, but I do have a question.
Okay, go for it.
That's so funny. My apologies if this is just I guess redundant, or if you're going to repeat something that was shared, but she was actually screaming at this point of the presentation, so I do have this question. It was around the section regarding the demographic shift that happened in East Palo Alto. I'd always heard, from my husband and his family that lived here around that time, that it was perhaps more, sorry, not it's so hard to focus when she's behind me, maybe more predominantly African American, and then I know that there is now less of an African American population and more Latinos. I guess if you could please, elaborate on what happened to bring about that shift. That one I'm always curious about.
Sure, and maybe Rolando and I can go 1, 2, because I think I'll set him up for the second part. There really are 2 significant demographic shifts that we would talk about. In the mid-50s, the shift was from an almost entirely white community. I think there was 1 African American family. There were several Asian American families, but there were actually very few Asian or Asian American families anymore at that point in time. It was a very, very white community. And then this whole blockbusting process happens. And it was really in the course, there's a great documentary that we would recommend called Dreams of a City. One of the things that they do, they show this classroom teacher, and her classroom, like in 1952, is white. And then in 53, you see a couple of African American kids. By 1956, it's majority African American. And that's a 5-year span. So that's the first big demographic shift. When I moved in '84, it was predominantly African American, significantly, definitely a majority, but with a strong Latino population. And then over the next 15 to 20 years, it became predominantly Latino, and that followed a lot of kinds of immigration sorts of things, which Rolando and I talked about yesterday. I don't see him on the screen, but I'm assuming he's going to jump in, so I'm going to jump out.
So in terms of the second part of that question, in terms of what perhaps prompted the Latino immigration and the growth, and again, some of you may have some better data, and I would love for you to chime in. I think that there is a generation of African American residents who own property, and property values started going up. And they took that ability to say to be able to sell their property and make some profit and be able to leave, to go back to other parts of the country where their families were from, or the Central Valley. So I think that drove some of that shift in the demographics from African American, primarily African American families. Interesting enough, there's a strong connection of the region of Fair Oaks and East Palo Alto to one particular town or two in the state of Michoacan in Mexico. And somebody wrote their PhD thesis, some anthropologist wrote a PhD thesis on that relationship with Aguililla and Apachingan in Michoacan. And there's some thoughts as to that those strong connections to that region may also have driven some of the influx of Latinos in the area. But there's also diversity in the Latino community. It's not just Mexicanos. There's Nicaraguenses, Salvadoreños, and and perhaps other folks from other parts of Latin America as well these days. So, Amy, anybody else, any additional thoughts?
I think that's good. Thank you. Thank you.
I would just say one of the kind of mechanisms of it was very much of a different process. It was not pre-planned, but one of the mechanisms of that second demographic shift was a migration pattern that is fairly common in the U.S. I mean, why there's a little town called Aguililla between these two big cities, and why are so many people here, and like Rolando said, in a section of Redwood City from that area? And what happens is, if your family is struggling and you're looking and you want to go somewhere and you want to have hope, the United States is a really big place and it's hard to understand. I've lived here my whole life. It's too big for me to comprehend. If I had never been here, it's just an idea. But if I know somebody who went and found a job and they can give me a lead with somebody who might get me a job, and they might have a lead on some housing. Maybe they're even going to let my family stay with them while I get rooted. That's where I'm going to go. And that's how a lot of the Latin American, I don't like that term, but I don't know, it's not just Mexican, it's Mexican, Central American, and to an extent South American immigration happens.
Yeah, I think one other kind of comment to wrap up some of the demographic changes. I think even though on the negative side, the sort of East Palo Alto's existence as a community of color, you know, a minority community is because of, you know, people in situations that are not ideal, and because of systemic racism and things like that, has also become a place of sanctuary for people of color, whether coming from outside of the United States or from within the United States, with kind of the initial creation of the African American community. But I think part of what makes East Palo Alto's identity so strong and wonderful in a positive way is the fact that this has been a place where people can gather, where people can you know, have positions of leadership and power within their own community. And that is a unique part of East Palo Alto, and you know, something that's really great about our community.
One more thought that came to mind, and that's one of the challenges that the shift demographics have brought, is there's a difference in social and civic engagement between the Latino community and the African American community that was in the city. Partly because of the immigration status of many of our families. They want to be not engaged civically. They're not going to lead in the front. So there's been, so in terms of a percentage of folks that can vote and actively involved in our civic process, I think that's one of the opportunities and challenges we have, is how do we get the Latino community more involved in these areas of influence. And that's, again, there's other reasons in terms of, you know, previous experience with government and lack of trust in systems and so on, that the Latinos may have experienced from before coming to the U.S.
Great. So we have a lot of questions that are along the same theme here. So I'm going to try to make it into one general question. And this has to do with present day dynamics in terms of the continued development of the community, both East Palo Alto proper and the Bellhaven neighborhood, which is also part of, when we say our community, what we refer to. So if you want to comment a little bit on the development and including gentrification and how you think that relates into the theme tonight of kind of race, and how that can be a factor in kind of the continued development of the community, and particularly gentrification.
Andrew, I'll let you start on this one.
I can see you didn't see my personal chat to you asking you to, or maybe you did. Anyway, you know, I think it's a very different thing than what we saw in the 50s, because I don't think there's an intentionality related to race. I think this is a market-driven sort of thing. Now, you could go and say a lot about why there is an inequity of assets and income and other things that, you know, when you look at sort of the different groups of people that we're talking about, and, you know, kind of where the economic strengths are. So I think this is a very different thing. The thing is, though, there's a certain sense in which it feels the same. And so there's this sort of innocence of, oh, you know, I'm just trying to move here. And there's also, I'm not being very articulate. There is also a certain sort of an innocence of folks coming into the community new. They're very positive and upbeat, and let's all get along, without any sense of what the history of the community is, and without any sense of why people feel the strong ties that they do to this community, and what is at stake that may be lost as it just gentrifies and starts to look like every other Silicon Valley little city that you drive through.
Yeah, another thought that comes to mind. Go ahead, Andrew.
Let me just add one more thing on that. One of the things that is so interesting to me, and Rolando, were you going to say anything about the diaspora? And I'm stealing from Rolando. You know what? Why don't you just mention that?
No, it's
okay.
No, go ahead.
So when we have these conversations, you know, one of the things that strikes us is that we're serving a whole bunch of folks in this community, and we also end up serving a bunch of folks who have deep, deep roots in the community, can't afford to live here anymore, but they still feel this really strong tie. And so, you know, Amika, I would bet that at your high school, you have a bunch of families like this who may live in Hayward or Fremont, or, you know, but their roots are East Palo Alto, and they want to do something to hold on to that connection. And we certainly see that with lots of the families that we know and have kids involved with.
I was just going to mention that I also believe that the job market and such, and especially in the tech world, is really driven by education, and I think this is the big gaps that you see. If you look at the average, what our the average education in our community is, and or even in our young people that go to school, go to university, but the percent of first generation students of color that complete a 4-year degree, much less in the tech field, is dismal. And I think all these educational gaps that we may have experienced are manifested in the job opportunities that our community is able to qualify for, especially as the tech world boom around us is alive and well. So I definitely feel that has an impact. I mean, just look at the amount of diversity in the tech world, and that's unfortunate.
This is Mitchell. I have a friend of mine. I'm not that familiar with East Palo Alto. I still remember back in Rodney King days. I worked for a company headquartered in Willow Row, and we had to close the office down because of protests, because African American population was still significant at that time. But I had a friend recently. He's in real estate business. He heavily invests on East Palo Alto. So he bought a rental home and refurbished the home, and he's renting for his target audience of Facebook employees. The going rate is maybe $4,000 or $5,000 a month for a small home, renovated. And then when he was driving around, he showed me, he said, "Oh, this house was sold for this much, and this was so there seemed to be a big target for people who want to invest on real estate, are maybe young people starting at Facebook." I'm just curious, because I think your data show in 2020 you predict white population actually on the increase. I wonder how big an effect is that, because for home buyers, East Palo Alto is still a good bargain right now, and so I can see the neighborhood started changes its demographic very quickly.
I definitely, Mitchell, I definitely feel that that's significant. Part of the shift in who's moving into the community today is definitely driven by the local employers, particularly Facebook. And I don't know the exact how that figure stands today in terms of the average or the median price of the home, but I can imagine it must be 3 or 4x what it was a decade or ago, and that's driven by investors.
Yeah, I didn't pay too much attention because I was helping the friend taking picture of his rental property, and but my thought was, compared to the rest of the South Bay, is still a good bargain, but they're not cheap. They're not like 50% off and nothing like that. Maybe 30% less than other areas, for example.
Right, and then you can see that in the rental market as well, where a studio in East Palo Alto is going for $1,800 to $2,000, and you can imagine, even though there's a lot of rent control ordinances, the moment a family leaves that apartment, that becomes a market value. At least that's, so there's a lot of pressure as well. And I believe this, unfortunately, the COVID-19 situation that we're in is the migration out of our community by many points.
Just to wrap up this section, thank you for all the questions about kind of the current dynamics and gentrification. And Andrew mentioned this some, but I wanted to kind of highlight it and draw it out. I think there is much less intention, particularly from a racial perspective regarding the current transitions in the community. But I think because of the community's history and the influence of race and who's in a position of power, who gets the good stuff and who gets the leftovers, there are so many parallels to what is happening now that is, as Andrew mentioned, things feel very similar, even though I think the intentions or some of the dynamics that are at play are different. But in terms of the experience of our community and what it feels like to have other people kind of controlling what happens to your community, controlling its identity, controlling who lives here, determining really key pieces, of East Palo Alto and Belhaven. It resonates, those dynamics very much with, much of the community's history. We want to make sure you guys are done by 8:30. So we are going to wrap up with a question about sort of what are some ways that people can respond that I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's always a good question to ask, as I think, the reason why, we're offering this is we want to be part of a movement towards change, and we want to help, our broader BCM family and those that are, involved with BCM's work in the community to be on a positive trajectory towards dealing with injustice, particularly around the area of race, and moving towards a more reconciled hope. So if Andrew, Rolando, you want to make a couple of closing comments on that, and then we'll wrap up, and grateful for your time. Rolando, I'll make you go first on this one because you made Andrew go first last time.
Awesome. What some thoughts that come to mind is our values as an organization are centered around diversity, are centered around active faith, are centered around teachable attitude. And I believe that one of the things that we can do as an organization is create space for these tough conversations. Create space where we can learn from each other, where we hold each other accountable. If ever I say something that's not right, I give you the ability to please pull me aside and help me learn. And if you think that's one thing that BCM has created over its history, it's created space for these conversations where you never knew, at least I was around then in the early days of BCM, but I heard of stories of around the dinner table, never quite know who was going to be around there, but because everybody was welcome. And I believe that act of breaking bread, of praying together, very, very powerful. And then part of the other thing is rallying around issues of justice that bring us together, doing something. We are definitely focused on making sure that children and their families are served through education, and then knowing who loves them the most. So those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Call to action. That's great. I'm going to frame mine. It's actually real similar to Rolando's. I'm going to frame mine around something that doesn't sound active, but it's about culture. I think Amika, I'm starting somewhere else. Amika, I appreciated what you said about just, that telling the truth. I think one of the things that needs to happen is we need to become a heck of a lot better about telling the truth and just recognizing reality. I don't remember the location. There's a museum in the South that chronicles all of the different publicly known killings of African Americans in the history of the country. It's unbelievable. It's a Holocaust museum. We learned a lot about the Holocaust as kids growing up in school. There's a lot that's a lot closer to home. And That's a heck of a lot more important. And the idea of talking about, well, why do we talk about stuff from history? Again, history is last week. There's an unbroken history. And we need to be real. And so one of the things that I think, one of the reasons I start thinking a lot about culture is, again, I'm really thinking of folks who are much more in power. It's really hard to recognize that we have a culture. We kind of think like we just go through the world the way it's supposed to be, you know, and I, you know, for me, I think of it as like, yeah, I mean, I think I was taught, even though nobody ever would have said this to me, the white way is the right way. You know, the white world is the way things are supposed to be. And everything else gets defined apart from that. And that's a real bad proposition. So I think trying to understand, you know, what is life really like, and what is it like if you're coming from a very different history and a very different background. And so, you know, I think listening is super important. I think for me, one of the biggest things transformationally for me was to be under an African-American leader. You know, I loved being at the church I was at, where my pastor was African-American. I got to be in leadership with him, and he was absolutely clearly the leader. That made a world of difference to me. When I was in Austin for 10 years recently, I was in a Christian organization, and I was bringing in some themes and emphases that were not normal for the organization, but they knew they were coming when they brought me on. And we'd always have the same conversation. And so I would talk about having certain voices at the table, and there would always be the same kind of an answer. Like, well, you know, they don't really represent such and such, or, you know, his perspective on this is going to be really different. And I'm like, that's the point. That is the point. If you don't have other people in the room, nothing ever changes. And I think that applies to businesses. I think it applies to every aspect of our culture. That didn't sound like a call to action. I don't know. Our friend Rajesh is doing silent protests on Sundays. Ask me more about that. They're kind of quiet. I don't know. I mean, I think that the real things, though, things have to change. And when you see something, step in and say something. When it's bull, call it for bull. I left that very polite. I like to tell stories. Some of you may know that about me. I'm going to tell a story. Can I do that? This could be the story to wrap up. Sure. I was on an airplane coming, I think, from Austin back home here when I lived here. There was an African-American gentleman with his son sitting in front of me. There was a guy sitting next to me. Something had come up in the news. This guy and I are talking about race. And he says, I just don't understand. You know, I don't understand why everybody wants to make this big deal. I mean, you know, all this stuff that happened 50 years ago and blah, blah, blah. And so then the man in front of us turns back and starts talking, and he engaged, and he was beautiful. He was awesome. And he says, when you say 50 years ago, what do you have in mind? And the guy sort of said some things, and he goes, where do you live? And it turns out they lived in developments really close to each other in the East Bay, super wealthy. These guys were like totally out of my league. And the African-American guy says to him, do you know when the covenants were lifted on the housing development that you live in? It wasn't 50 years ago. It was 7 years ago today. And the guy's like, no, that can't be. And he's, oh yeah, that is the case. You know when they were lifted in the, and he was just very calm, and he's just explaining things. And, you know, and then at some point his son came in and started talking, and I was like, oh my gosh, if I ever have kids, I want to raise kids to be like that. I want them. He was very factual, and he just kept saying, like, I don't understand why you think like that, you know. But one of the other things is, I think these you know, sometimes people are like, why do we keep having this conversation? We keep having it because it's important and because there's no resolution. And you know, it's very easy to have this with all the marches and protests that happened recently. You know, my oldest was saying, so what's going to happen? He goes, I think it's great that all these churches have gotten involved in this. I think it's great. And I really think it's hopeful, and it might mean change, but it also may mean that 3 weeks from now they've moved on to something else. And I was like, yes, amen. And that's where the problem is. So I don't know. I'm done.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Rolando. Yeah, to kind of piggyback just briefly on the call to action and what was being shared, I think the reality is we still live in very segregated ways. Education is segregated. Churches are often segregated. Who works where is segregated. Who our friends and our social circles are is segregated, and we don't hear one another's stories. And I think it's really important and necessary that we do, because I don't think it's possible to be reconciled with people that you don't interact with and you don't know about their lives, you don't know their realities and their experiences. And I think there's been a lot of separation. And I think one of the things that's really beautiful about BCM is the ability to bring people together across those divides of race, divides of socioeconomic background, divides of you know, immigration status and age, and so many other things. And so I think the reality that we need to have real relationships where we have real conversation and listen. And there was some in the chat, you know, about including different voices in, you know, at all levels of life, that is really necessary. And I think something that is broken in the way things function today. And so I think the fact that you all are here gives hope, you know, for the development of those relationships, of listening to those stories, so that we can be a part of bringing about change. Because I think it's hard to want to bring change for, you know, for example, for a group of people that you never interact with and you don't talk to and you don't know anything about their lives. And so I think that's, to me, one of my favorite parts about East Palo Alto, about BCM, and brings me hope. Wanted to say thank you all so very much for being here tonight, for being on probably yet another Zoom or some version of a video, you know, conversation or meeting. But we really appreciate you all as the BCM family, and are grateful for your time tonight. This has been recorded, so I will send it out so you can review it or share it with others. And with that, just want to ask Rolando to close us in prayer, and then I'll hang out if anyone wants to hang on the call for a few minutes, but we'll officially be done after Rolando prays. So, Rolando.
Okay. Gracious Father, Lord, we want to lift you up this evening, Lord. We want to thank you for being present, Father. And you know our hearts, Lord. You know the struggles we are dealing with, Lord, as we witness so much racial injustice around us, Lord. And we want to be part of your solution, Father. And we want to lift you up and ask that you encourage us, Lord, to be able to tell and hear our stories so we can learn from one another, Lord. So ultimately we can reflect your love and your patience and your grace as you have so bestowed upon us, Lord. Just want to just say thank you, Lord, for BCM and to been at work in our community, and let it be an agent of change and growth in helping our families and the children, Lord, grow more closer to you, Lord. Just want to lift up this time and want to say we love you, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight.
Thank you for putting it on.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And if any of you kind of want to hang around for a few minutes, we'll leave the call on, but I am officially going to stop the recording here.
Is that Marcus, my friend Marcus Givens?